I brought a little show and tell for today's message. So I brought a rock. Now, of course, this isn't my like little friend that I've been carrying all my life. It's just a rock I found in the forest. Now, each of us is a living stone of the church. And remember, the church is the assembly. So often when we hear church, we think of a building, but the people are more important than a building. And so it's interesting in the gospel, and Jesus says, Peter, um, on this rock I will build my church. Now we often think my church, it's my church, it's I do these things, I try to control people, or we think, oh, the church belongs to the Pope. No, the church belongs to Christ. It's so important, and we belong to Christ. And this is a gift. This is not, oh no, this is a great gift, and we ought to celebrate in the presence of Christ among the assembly of people, especially who gather in his name. Now, it's interesting, today we celebrate Peter and Paul, and yet Peter and Paul would both say, well, the risen Lord is more important than we are. I mean, it's the risen Lord that they both had an experience of, and the risen Lord that encouraged them, inspired them, helped them both to persevere. And as they continued to persevere, they would recognize that God's grace was truly with them, whether things were good, whether things were bad or ugly. In the gospel reading, Jesus asked for the popular opinion of the people. Who do people say that I am? And the best answer that people can come up with is a prophet. But, we have to cut people some slack, because they're not hanging out with Jesus as much as the disciples. But if we think about it, God the Father, says twice in the scriptures, at Jesus' baptism and also at Jesus' transfiguration, listen to him. Listen to the beloved Son. So it's so important that all Christians are to take time to listen to the beloved Son. Spending time in scriptures or spiritual reading, or simply to just be quiet. And then what does Jesus Christ say the most often in scriptures for us to do, all of us to do, is to follow him. Follow his example. But if we're going to put Jesus' example into practice, and Peter and Paul would agree with this, we need God's grace. In the second reading, Paul is going to receive the crown of righteousness in Christ. I mean, he doesn't do this on his own effort. He recognizes that it's God's grace given to him that allows him to receive this crown of righteousness. But he has done his part, and of course God will always do God's part, because God is faithful. And so then Jesus asked the disciples, now, who do you say that I am? And Peter has listened to Jesus enough times, he's followed Jesus enough to make this proclamation of faith, but ultimately it's the Spirit that gives him the words that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So he's more than a prophet. He's the Messiah, the Christ, the one who's going to restore Israel. But more than restore Israel, he's going to restore all of humanity. Each and every person, through his death and resurrection, Jesus is going to restore. And then he's the Son of the living God. And as we come to know, he is the second person of the Trinity. Now, of course, at this point in time, the only way that Peter can really say this is once again through the Spirit. But we have to also personalize this for ourselves. Who do you say that I am? Who is Christ for you today? And of course, the Christ that we need today might be different than the Christ we need tomorrow. Maybe today we need a healing Christ. Maybe today we need Jesus to teach us something, to navigate something in our life. Maybe at times we need to be inspired, we need to be encouraged. And so, the Christ is quite an amazing figure, and we can always draw good things from Christ. Now, in the first reading, we have King Herod, who is martyred James. And, of course, this could cause a bit of fear in the early assembly, and yet they continue to persevere. Now, Peter is thrown in prison, so he's not martyred at this point in time, because, we all have a different path. I draw from 1 Corinthians 12:4-7. We've all been given gifts from the Spirit. These gifts are to serve the Lord, and it's God who works through us to carry out these gifts. And of course, the gifts we have today may differ from the gifts tomorrow, depending on our life situation. But Peter is in prison, and he doesn't actually realize that an angel is at work or God's grace is at work until after the fact. We need times of reflection. That's why places like Mount St. Francis exist, so we can reflect on our lives and be aware of how often God is present in our lives. And we don't often notice it in the present moment, but when we reflect on our lives, we notice this. And so as we gather around the table, Lord, let us celebrate in the risen Lord. Let us celebrate in Jesus' perseverance that helps us to persevere. And may we be strengthened by the risen Lord to continue to cooperate with God's grace in our lives for the benefit of others.